Hey again, everybody. So it is an exciting time in the world of the Japan travel ban. Some of the latest newsworthy items include the resignation of Shinzo Abe and the fact that as of September, which is this month now, all foreign residents are theoretically allowed to re-enter Japan. It's not the case in practice necessarily, but that's a topic for another video. The topic of today's video relates to a provocative question I received from a reader via email. He says, "Hi Robert, thank you for all your work explaining the intricacies of the hashtag Japan travel ban. This all seems rather complicated, but what if it's actually simple? What if Japan is just waiting, open quote, until there's a vaccine, close quote, to reopen the border in a big way?" So I really appreciate this question. And I say it's very provocative. I think the topic of vaccines and waiting until there's a vaccine in general is quite provocative. But to be honest, I've received this question a lot. I've seen it a lot in discussions about the ban. So the first way I would answer this is to say that up until pretty recently, i.e. when the controversy surrounding residents not being able to re-enter Japan became sort of mainstream, I don't think that the plan was to reopen based on when and if a vaccine was available. So I think the initial plan, certainly back in May and June, when it looked like there might not be a second wave of any kind globally or in Japan, I think the idea was that there was going to be the tiered reopening. It was going to be business people, then students, then tourists. But unfortunately, when it became clear that Japan was really in the wrong in terms of locking residents out, unlike all the other G7 nations, I think that collapsed, and it collapsed alongside the sort of exponential growth in cases worldwide throughout July and August. So I don't think the initial plan was to wait until a vaccine. Right now, I'm not really sure if that's the official plan, but I'll say a couple things. So I would say in general, there's a problem with the idea of waiting until there's a vaccine, both in terms of reopening borders in Japan and elsewhere, and I think in terms of getting the world back to normal as a whole. And I want to give a disclaimer before I go more into this, because I am not an anti-vaxxer. In fact, I would say I'm probably one of the most pro-vaccine people you'll ever meet. I have tweeted multiple times with the hashtag vaccines work, and I'm going to be the first in line once a coronavirus vaccine is FDA approved. With this being said, I mean, there are a lot of issues regarding the in development coronavirus vaccines, most notably that the first vaccines developed to prevent a pathogen are usually not fully effective. And I guess more generally than that, a vaccine is not a magic bullet, right? It's a piece of the puzzle, not a master key. A vaccine on its own, unless it's one that's 90 to 95% effective or fully sterilizing, is not going to end the pandemic. So I think the problem with Japan, since we're talking about Japan and its hashtag Japan entry ban, waiting until a vaccine arrives to reopen its border in a meaningful way, the problem with that idea is that it sort of is based upon this assumption, this false assumption that a vaccine is a magic bullet and that it's like flipping a switch and suddenly the pandemic's going to be over. So let's wargame this out. So I think the best case scenario right now for scientists around the world probably relates to the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. And I've heard people say that there could be safety and efficacy signals as early as later this month, which is September or October, which could result in FDA approval in the US in November or December, probably more likely December for a full approval as opposed to an EUA emergency use authorization, which would mean that in the very best case scenario, we're looking at widespread availability in March and April, which is just a few months before the Olympics in Tokyo are to begin, if they actually end up taking place. And here's the problem with this first and foremost. If we only have a vaccine 3 months before the Olympics, and a vaccine is only the beginning of reopening the border of Japan to tourists, that's not a lot of time to work out kinks before an event of that size and magnitude. So right there, that's a huge problem. I think personally it would make more sense to start reopening the border to tourists during the low season, at least the low season outside of Niseko and Nagano, which would be in December or January, which yes, might be before a vaccine, but here's why. I think during these times when a lot of people are not likely to visit Japan anyway, it will allow the government to implement other sort of new normal mechanisms to regulate the entry of people and their behavior once they get to Japan. So I'm thinking, for example, different testing methods at the border, triaging travelers based on where they're coming from. So, for example, people that come from safe countries such as Taiwan and New Zealand might not need to quarantine at all if they test negative, whereas people coming from the United States or India might need to quarantine for 14 days regardless. Gauging the extent to which tourists are willing to adhere to best practices like avoiding the 3 Cs, wearing masks, so on and so forth. And this way, if the Japanese government is able to put in place a system that allows tourists to return to Japan safely, more or less, before there's a vaccine, once there is a vaccine, that is simply going to relieve pressure on the system instead of cause additional pressure. And then if the vaccine happens to be sterilizing or close to it and really does bring the pandemic to heel worldwide, that's an added bonus. But I think that the Japanese government right now, and governments around the world, frankly, both in terms of tourism and otherwise, they need to prepare for a safe and functional future where there is no sterilizing vaccine for a year or two, because to be honest, that is the most likely outcome at this point. And as much as it might make sense from a solely public health perspective to just keep the world in suspended animation until then, we don't live in a world where public health is the absolute only concern. And I'm sorry we don't, but that's just a reality. Now I just wanted to say, this video has focused specifically on the tourism piece, and that's number one, because I was asked this question with specific regard to tourism. And number two, quite frankly, I don't think tourism gets enough attention in this hashtag Japan travel ban discussion. And I say that fully respecting the fact that residents of Japan and people with Japanese spouses and children should absolutely have priority, as well as students and anybody else who has a legal status in Japan. But I think that even separating out the fact that I do work in the tourism industry and that my livelihood literally depends on the return of tourism to Japan, it really is a gauge for the not only the economy of Japan, but the global economy more generally. The more people are moving around the world freely, the better the economy is. And I think that there is a real need to get tourism going in a meaningful way around the world, with or without a vaccine. And now we need to do that safely. We need to implement global protocols just as we did after the September 11th attacks. But again, a vaccine is a puzzle piece. It is not a master key.